And that's the kind of resonance that you almost basically physically feel in work when you bring high ideals into it. So there's a beauty in working at your best. And then all the little things that make it tough become things that make the ideals shine even more brightly. So if you're aiming to do something more generously and that becomes kind of painful, well, then the generosity just shines more and you resonate more deeply with the ideal.
Before we get started, if you enjoy these episodes, you might want to check out more at OptimalWork.com. Our website offers unique content, tools, and exercises to help you thrive at work and beyond. We have an in-depth masterclass covering our entire theory of growth, daily recommendations for personalized advice, and a platform to help groups and organizations learn and practice optimal work together. You can get a free trial at OptimalWork.com. Now let's start the episode. Hey, this is Sharif here with another episode of the Optimal Work podcast, joined by Dr. Kevin Majors. Kevin, good to be back here with you again.
Hey, Sharif, thanks for having me back.
Yeah, of course. Well, Kevin, last week we did an episode on the golden hour, so we're kind of getting to these basic topics, these fundamental topics of optimal work. I thought this episode we could do reframing to cover that for people who maybe have not heard, a whole episode on reframing or have not yet gotten a chance to take the masterclass. I thought we could do a little bit of a deep dive into reframing.
Sounds awesome.
Yeah. So I guess maybe just to start with the background of how it got incorporated into our approach and your approach, where you first developed the idea of reframing. It'd be a great place to start.
Yeah, well, to some extent, this has been around cognitive therapy forever. So the idea that, in old cognitive therapy, what you would do is have people practice putting their thoughts down on paper, particularly the most troubling thoughts. And then they would work with them to look for evidence for and against and work them until they come to some kind of balanced thought. And then they would see that they actually felt a lot better. Well, in the end, what happens is people, by learning to work their thoughts like this and to try to get them a little more in touch with reality, ended up seeing negative thoughts as opportunities for practice. And I think that is the core then eventually of cognitive therapy, that you look to see that whatever seems most difficult, in fact, is giving you an opportunity to practice some new skills, or even higher, to practice ideals or to deepen bonds. So the core of that idea that you're helping people learn a new way of practicing and to approach threats as opportunities, that goes really back far into cognitive therapy and even behavioral therapy. But what I had the experience of was, I got to teach some really fantastically smart residents at Harvard Med School. And I remember presenting to them the whole model of the amygdala. And this was in an early class I had with this particular group. And I asked them when I was finished with the model, and they loved it. They were asking all these questions. They're very engaged. And I said, okay, now what's missing from this model? And I asked that with no preconceived idea of what the answer is. So, and one of the residents raised her hand. She said, what about the role of expectations in all of this? And I thought that was fantastic. And I thought, yes, in fact, that's right. That this model is just dealing with the behavior part of things. The amygdala model is showing how that when your amygdala detects a threat, it starts to sound the alarm, which you experience as anxiety, but then it watches your response and to see, are you approaching or avoiding the supposed threat? So the whole of behavioral therapy is getting people to approach the supposed threat, if it's safe, and to do safety learning. So it's a very robust model, but it's true that it doesn't address the role of thoughts and how much of a person's experience of a threat is really changed by the thoughts they have about it going into it. So the example of if a person's giving a public speech, imagine that going for 5 days leading up to that speech, the person is just constantly dreading it and worrying, saying, oh no, it's going to be terrible. They're going to hate it. I'm going to be asked questions. I won't be able to answer them. And all the thoughts that people could have going up into some kind of performance of a speech. Well, the more people learn, how to start working with their own expectations, the easier it is then for them to start to see that speech in a whole new way. So they have to learn to identify in this speech what are the elements that they can actually look forward to practicing. So how do they start to see this whole thing as exactly the practice that they need? So eventually want them to get to the point where they can have such a full view of what the practice this is giving, how much it's going to help them love and serve others, that they're actually grateful for it. So if you really are helping people to reframe upcoming challenges, that ends up being a powerful way of affecting their whole experience of the challenge when it eventually arrives. So that's a long answer, but that's the trajectory of it. That it was actually a resident who pointed out the need for this part of the model. It's not part of the amygdala model, but it's certainly a part of cognitive behavioral therapy.
Mm-hmm. So then following up on that and how it integrates into that model. So I suppose when you have a threat, when you have anxiety, the important thing is to undergo safety learning to teach yourself, hey, this thing isn't as much of a threat as maybe I previously thought, or as my kind of brain was predicting. So I want to approach the threat with my behavior to teach my brain that this thing is not a threat. So then reframing makes it easier for you to approach the threat and do the safety learning. Is that the role that it's playing here in the model?
Yeah, absolutely. I also think that every time you're dreading something that's coming up, that moment of dread is a unique opportunity for a kind of micro rehearsal. You take the thing that you're fearing, and instead of letting yourself spin in worries about it, just to think, okay, how is this giving me an opportunity that I can embrace? Already in your mind, you're leaning into it. You're opening yourself to whatever you're feeling and leaning into it. Well, it's a lot like doing exposures in advance. So I think that when our mind is dreading, it's really like our brain is just showing us, okay, we have these negative predictions. Do you want to do anything with them? And if you just keep seconding those negative predictions by letting yourself worry, well, then that's going to make it harder to deal with. But you could take every moment you dread something could be a chance to practice reframing that very thing. Practice seeing it in a new way. And I think really the more you practice these new predictions of how it can bring out your best, the more you start learning to look forward to it. It's amazing that you can really shape your predictions through the skill of reframing.
Before we continue, a brief message. If you're benefiting from these discussions, please take a moment to hit like and subscribe. Doing so helps us to reach more people. So you're not just learning, you're also helping others to discover a path of growth and flourishing. Thanks for your support. Okay, so shaping your predictions and that helps to then foster these right behaviors. And then I'd also like to tie in another element of reframing that when you told me about reframing many years ago, that was really impactful for me, which is the idea that of bringing in ideals into work and kind of making it more meaningful, these challenges that you experience. I think it's easy for someone doing a kind of like 9-to-5 grind that you're just, okay, you're doing your tasks and then over time they get rote or you have a difficult day and you start thinking, why am I even doing this? And so reframing, or someone with burnout or anxiety, that these reframing is just helps you to bring meaning into these challenges and work with a deeper sense of purpose. So how does then purpose tie into this idea of reframing to foster these better behaviors? How does that all tie together in your mind?
Yeah, maybe you could say in a way, when you're seeing these deeper sources of meaning, you're seeing how in some way the sacrifice of doing this whole thing is worth it. So the difficulty in the task, there's a kind of friction and resistance and effort required and all these things. All of that has to in some way, I think, be ennobled. And bringing an ideal into the very end goal, what you're aiming for, ennobles all the effort before it as well. So if you're thinking of doing this talk very well as a way of serving and being generous or you know, and that it's giving you a chance to, in advance, welcome any little humiliations that come up in the course of it, and knowing that like that, the embracing that shame could be a fantastic way of overcoming all fears of what other people think and growing in real humility. You could be thinking about the fortitude you're growing by facing up to something that in fact kind of gives you trepidation. Well, all of then the ideal that you bring in to the final act, like say giving the talk, it ennobles everything all along the way. And it makes in some way the sacrifice involved with the effort itself more lovable. Because it's higher and it's something that stretches you and it's bringing out your best then all along the way. So that's very different than acting just for the sake of a particular outcome. So, and I think that we need to get good at shifting what gives us essentially dopamine, what gives us a sense of motivation and drives us to work at our best. We have to shift it always from outcomes to these kinds of ideals and that you're aiming for higher things, not things that are just contained in the work, but things that transcend it. And that, in fact, things that are more permanent that stay with you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think I'm not sure if we've talked about this idea of unity of life a lot here on the OptimalWork podcast, but it seems like that's what we're after, is that the different actions that you perform throughout the day have the same purpose, so that everything is in your life is pushing in the same direction, and ideals enable that. And then reframing, bringing those ideals into this particular task, it just harmonizes the different areas of your life, your work, your family life, even within work, all the individual tasks, that it's not just each discrete task is separate. I just want to get this thing done, but it gives them all, it ties them all together and gives this kind of richness of purpose to everything that you're doing. So I think that's another area that I've appreciated a lot.
Yeah, it should be that that every moment of our day is giving us an opportunity in some way to bring in our highest ideals, so that we're seeing ways of loving and serving constantly throughout the day. I think a wonderful practice in reframing itself is the practice of slowing down to put a little more care and a little more love into very small actions. So just that willingness is already a kind of sacrifice that we make. But what it does is it brings those ideals into the moment. So, and that can be a very contemplative practice. But you can see that what you're doing then with like that one little thing, like, how you are putting order into your bedroom before you start the day. Well, that little thing is capable of so many ideals being brought into it. But in a way, what reframing always does is it lets you then widen the context in which you're seeing everything. That you're preparing then yourself for how you're going to meet the day. You're preparing yourself for how you're going to meet life. You're even preparing yourself for how you're going to meet death. So, which is in some ways the final challenge. And the idea is like, if you can see the ideals that you want to be filling you at that moment, that in a sense gives meaning to then all of the difficulties, all the challenges that happen up until that time. So it's all, that we're in a sense, we're always using reframing to extend our view and then to see the higher ideals that can be brought into the smaller actions.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. And so one question, this kind of ties back a little bit to the episode last week. I get this question sometimes that, okay, do I really need to reframe if I'm about to start a task and I'm ready to just jump in? I'm ready to do it. I don't feel reluctant at all. Do I really need to take the time to reframe there? And it seems like with that question, there's kind of the implicit assumption that the most important thing is just performing the behavior, performing the action. And so the whole purpose of reframing on this view is to prepare yourself to perform that action. But really what we're saying here is that reframing is about really deepening the sense of purpose, kind of ennobling the action, and then it helps you to do the action in a new and better way maybe. So you're saying you should always be reframing to deepen the ideals that you can bring to this next task or whatever it is that you're about to do.
Yeah, I mean, really think about the course of someone's life. If everything was always easy and they just got it done, and then they got the next thing done, and they got the next thing done, and that week was easy, I got it done, and then that month, that year, there would actually be no meaning at all then in that person's life. Because when we're doing things to get them done, that doesn't itself, like outcomes don't give meaning. Outcomes have to serve meaning. So the outcome is a means to an end. But if the outcome is an end in itself, which is what you're doing, if you're saying, I'm just gonna get this done, it's like saying the finished project is just gonna be the end. What reframing always does is sees outcomes as means. And so they're kind of, this task then, I could just get it done, and that, that might fulfill some like duties of justice. That might be great at its own level. I'm not saying that's bad, but it can be compatible with getting burnt out. It can be compatible with, in fact, becoming more liable to getting overstressed when things get hard. So you can get attached to how easy it is. It seems to me that we need to find continually ways of, like, I say, like, this is not the right idea, but of stressing ourselves. This is like the idea behind taking cold showers. That a lot of people recommend the idea of like the cold shower because it is a way that people are practicing stressing themselves deliberately, and that kind of practice makes people more able to handle stress. So that way they're not stress intolerant. So there's these regular ways. It could be once or twice a week or 7 days a week, that the cold shower is a way of deliberately stressing yourself. Well, that's just a little snapshot of, I think, what takes place when we are trying to raise our sights for what does it look like to do this work as well as I could? What would it look like for this to really bring out my best? And that's the crucial question. Getting it done isn't your best. And then I think we find that our heart has this kind of coefficient of expansion that it's able to resonate more and more deeply the higher the ideals it brings into the task. There's a sense of resonance. It's like the heart rings. It resonates with ideals. It doesn't ring with outcomes. If the heart were a gong and, trying to use outcomes to make it resonate would be like hitting a gong with a plastic fork. But I think ideals actually cause the gong to resound more deeply. And that's the kind of resonance that you almost basically physically feel in work when you bring high ideals into it. So there's a beauty in working at your best. And then all the little things that make it tough become things that make the ideals shine even more brightly. So if you're aiming to do something more generously and that becomes kind of painful, well, then the generosity just shines more and you resonate more deeply with the ideal.
Mm-hmm. So now you've identified ideals as a way of reframing. And so I guess every way of reframing and is kind of is a source of meaning, and every source of meaning is a way of reframing. And maybe we could just fill out that picture a little bit more. So is there anything in addition to ideals? Obviously, we talk about skills, ideals, and bonds as kind of the key sources.
Yeah, that's a nice way of thinking of it. Yeah, because what that does is it lets you start to think just more granularly, like, okay, what is the particular thing I could do better here? If you can identify a skill. So I think, for instance, there are general skills that people need to learn to do well if their work and life is going to bring out their best. One of those is pausing before you start things. Okay, that's a little skill. It's a really important skill that you not just dive into doing things, but that you learn how to recollect yourself with a pause briefly that would be unnoticeable to people watching you. But in your mind, there's a little pause taking place. Okay, that opens up huge new vistas of growth, because in that one little pause, you can then start to reframe the task, bring in the higher ideals, make the effort worthwhile, that all the effort in the task is like a sacrifice that will help you just love and serve others better. Okay, that's all very important. Another really important skill is stopping things on time. So to really honor stop times. That makes all these other ones, you can become more available for others. You live greater fortitude. You live detachment. You live, the more generosity and availability. There's all these things that feed into. So you can see some of these skills they're great in themselves. They're like habits you form. But then those skills all form part of being able to bring higher ideals into the task. And then the highest ideal the idea of all ideals is love. Love is the sum of all ideals. It's like when you put them all together, that's what you get. And so it calls forth every ideal in us. Love is really what the heart resonating is all about. And if we could be doing everything with a sense of love, we'd be resonating and staying in flow all day long. So that's where we talk about bonds, because love just doesn't happen in the abstract. Love actually is the result of, the bonds we have with others and the shared resonance. So learning to focus on the bonds in our life and to be working on deepening those. If bonds have trouble, you'll find the greatest lift in your psychological well-being by aiming to bring ideals in and work those bonds, to see that work of putting bonds right is the precious thing. That is where the real growth takes place. That's where the kind of smoothing of the rough edges in our character takes place. It has to happen. So it's not like bonds are just meant to be perfect. There's always going to be an element of working the bonds, making them better. And that is a beautiful task, that is like, that turns us really into peacemakers, I would say. That it's like learning how to deepen and stabilize and purify bonds.
Okay, Kevin, last question, because we're basically out of time here. One thing we talk about in relation to reframing is also strategies. So reframing is about identifying the best end to be aiming for. But then to really approach it and to engage that challenge, you also need to have a sense, not just that this is good, that there's like a deep good here for me to attain, but also that it's possible so that I can see the path forward. And that, so is creating and that would be the strategy, is I know how to do this thing. I have a good path forward. Is that also, how do you see the relationship between those two things?
Yeah, I think that only work makes the reframe real in the end. It's like that is how we make our ideals concrete. And that's the function of work. It's like it kind of bridges these two domains. So our ideals exist kind of inside of us, but then they're brought into reality through work itself, which is the work. That's what strategies do. It's just taking your work and then aiming it for the goal, because a strategy always will have the right goal in mind. That could be aiming for some ideal in your work, but also then the steps you're going to take to get there, the practical steps that will bring you to the goal. So I think that if what reframing does is it opens us up to understand more clearly than the whole of our present situation. And it helps us to kind of think of ways that we can be uplifted and inspired, that we can be, in a sense, encouraged, to flip our view of any threats here, of any challenges here, difficulties, into ways that actually could bring out our best, to the point that we're now grateful for them. But that always has to end with a practical plan, so that now we're able to think of concrete steps that we'll do differently, because now we're using them not just to get the outcome done, but to use that outcome to attain a higher end.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Okay, I know that I said that would be my last question, but I'll just have one more follow-up question, because you kind of tied that one into challenge, this strategy and steps and making a concrete goal. Mm-hmm. And for people who've been following OptimalWork, they know that we talk about reframing, mindfulness, and challenge. So mindfulness is kind of the last one we haven't really talked about and tied in, and maybe we can do deeper dives into mindfulness and challenge in subsequent episodes. But maybe you could just briefly tie in mindfulness to what we've been talking about here with reframing as well.
Well, this gets to the idea that our experience at any moment is actually a combination of two things. One is our predictions for that moment, and the other is the reality of that moment. So experience equals predictions plus reality. And that's true it's true at every level, basically. So even if you think about the room that you're in as you listen to me speak, your perception of that room right now is a combination of your brain's predictions of what's in the room and then your experience of the reality of the room. The more you would mindfully open up to reality, what that does is it tends to then to move your experience more towards reality and less towards your prediction. That's helpful, because if you had any errors in prediction, then that would get clarified. So, and you would see that Just imagine like a person, they're like looking out a beautiful picture window, and they always look out this window and they just see kind of there. But then they look more closely at the window and they realize, oh, there's a crack going through it. Well, they'd never even seen that for who knows how long it had been there. Well, that's because what they're experiencing of that window was just their prediction, plus some reality of what's on the other side of it. Mindfulness then opens you up to reality and tunes your brain more into it, correcting any errors you made in predictions. So reframing basically is how you shape predictions, that part of the equation, and mindfulness is how you shape your perception of reality. But if you're going to go one step further, you say when you challenge yourself and engage with action, then in fact you shape reality itself. And that's the best way of shaping your predictions, because ultimately what your brain is trying to predict is what you're going to do next. So this is partly what's behind ideas like fake it till you make it. But what that really could mean is act with great confidence, and you will start to feel more confident. Act with great temperance, and you'll start to feel more temperate. And so there's you aim for ideals actually as ways you want to act, and then gradually the predictions align with them, and the ideal itself then becomes something that you're predicting. That's what a virtue is. So now the predictions have changed to incorporate the ideal into the reality that it expects. We can talk about that whole theory of virtue another time.
Okay, let's do it. Maybe next episode we can do that.
All right, great.
Okay, great, Kevin. Thanks so much.
All right, Sharif, good seeing you.
Yeah, we'll be back next week. Thanks for tuning in to today's episode. If you enjoyed our conversation and you're looking for more in-depth guidance, check out OptimalWork.com, our unique platform that delivers content, tools, and exercises to help you thrive at work and beyond.